What's up, everyone? It's Adar coming at you with another episode of Startup Engineering Daily. Let's hop right into it. So, our first story is from Jared Palmer, formerly at Vercel, now at Microsoft, working on GitHub. I thought he was VP of GitHub, but I guess he's VP of Core AI at Microsoft now. So, that's kind of interesting. But essentially, they've announced that stacked PRs on GitHub are now in private preview. You can join the waitlist and learn more at this link. There's comedy about GStack and all that, but I won't even go into it. But basically, in this demo, it just kind of shows that the UI is going to be more integrated now to support stacked PRs. So you'll be able to see, like, kind of hear how much PRs you have stacked on top of each other. It'll also give like warnings at the bottom, like PRs earlier in the stack are ready to merge. So pretty cool updates from the UI perspective on GitHub. You know, there's been a lot of debate. We've talked about like how if GitHub is going to be replaced in the age of AI or if it's just going to be improved. There was a lot of people trashing it. It was really slow with reviewing like massive PRs and these things, but they have been making performance improvements and they do have a pretty dedicated team, it seems, even though a lot of them were laid off. So pretty cool. And a lot of people were clowning on them because this link itself, the github.github.com, is like a Astro template, so it's not really good UI and it's kind of old school, but that's not really that important. You know, the main thing that's important is like what's getting shipped to the GitHub, and it is in private preview, so they haven't even moved it to the normal GitHub docs yet, but pretty cool, and I'll definitely check this out once it's available because I personally think that stacked PRs are really solid. Like Reese Sullivan says in one of his tweets that it really helps you break down like agentic work, you know, if you're doing a lot of big changes, which a lot of big changes are required now to deliver features usually. It makes a lot of sense to stack those up into PRs, and then it's very easy for the human review. Okay, next we have a really unexpected tweet from Primeagen, but, you know, very interesting to see, and he's saying that he's slowly coming around to AI-assisted programming. He's genuinely trying to codify every rule about programming that he has, and using that plus several stages to build out small changes. Not sure the productivity changes, but I think I can see modest gain in speed. I'm also just trebucheting slop over the wall, which is interesting because what does that mean? That productivity doesn't change, but if he sees a gain in speed, like that's effectively productivity changing. But I really agree with this fundamentally. Like the whole point of AI is not that we can like do a bunch more slop all at once. The whole point is that we can actually take advantage of really small teams and, you know, like single developer experiences. Like when you're building a feature and you're trying to deliver it in the same amount of time that you would previously, now you can do a lot more runs over it. And Prime was one of the first people to even talk about this, where like he was very much in favor of like writing the code once and then reviewing it and then actually just writing it all again. That was even like pre-AI. That was like in the early 2020s that he was talking about this. So it's kind of cool that like AI has kind of learned to fundamentally do that, where like now instead of just having to write it manually a bunch of times, you can have the AI write it, you can review it, and then you can just prompt it again to be what you want. And also codifying every rule, you know, that speaks to like using linters and testing, which is what Uncle Bob is saying here as well. You know, acceptance testers, linters, dependency checkers. I'm sure he's still doing red green refactor testing, which is like test driven development, which I do think AI is pretty solid at as well. But you do need like these good test harnesses, you know, like where you're kind of mocking everything. People still hate on mocking. People used to hate on mocking a lot, but I thought that was kind of misguided because it's like, what are you going to do? Actually make a stripe call in every single API call? So I guess you could with test mode, and there's pieces to that as well, but at a certain level you will have to mock things if you want to have like really strong unit tested test driven design. But nonetheless, pretty interesting that Prime's coming around to AI assisted programming, because I think one of the tweets we'll cover today or tomorrow also talks about how like people at the Devon team, which is a AI tool, have actually started going back to manually writing their code and using AI for research. And I think the Reese tweet we're going to cover later also speaks on that. Okay, next we kind of have an interesting like story to discuss. It's not that important, but it kind of leads to some similar ideas and similar values that we're going to have to figure out in the age of AI, and also just like the age of open source as well, because obviously Mario Zechner, who has become super popular now, I would thank Theo for it, but the Pi coding agent, which is what he pioneers and develops, I believe, solo, has become super popular like over the past month or so, or past few weeks. And he basically wants to hire a team, is the main piece that he wants to figure out here. And I think he wants to raise money as well. But he's like, the investors need to know the addressable market size. So basically it gets back to telemetry and like tracking your users. And open source people hate tracking so much, you know, which is interesting compared to like when you use a closed source product like Claude or OpenAI, they're tracking the hell out of everything. You know, they have mad telemetry that they're tracking, like analytics and all of that. And people are pretty much okay with it because it's behind the scenes. But I guess with open source and just like the open source community, they're so against tracking and they want to be anonymous and they just want to take advantage of what they can, which is totally respectable. But basically they're trying to figure out this middle ground, or Mario's trying to figure out this middle ground of how much tracking can they do to basically get all the investor needs and the monetary needs. And, you know, they won't even have monetization at first, but also like a lot of these companies don't have monetization and they're kind of just like trying to gather users as much as possible, you know, and maybe like a bun acquisition to Anthropic, or figuring out some kind of like hosted system or some enterprise software that they can build on top of their open source software. That's kind of like the go-to now for commercial open source, which is what the cow.com guys pretty much pioneered as far as I can tell. And then you look at some of the examples here, like Obsidian is not an open source tool, but they don't have any telemetry. So it's completely anonymous, but they kind of have like predictions or estimates of how many users they have just based on like internet sentiment, I guess, is the best way to figure it out. Yeah, nonetheless, kind of interesting to keep up with it. And like, I work on closed source software, so I don't have these problems. For me, if anything, like my problems is that I don't track enough. Like I need to do like these really detailed funnels and analytics and all these different things to figure out what our users are doing and prioritize features. But you kind of have to do that as feature work itself instead of building new features or instead of doing anything else. So it's kind of like that prioritization problem. But nonetheless, I'm a big fan of the Pi coding agent, especially because of how much it respects skills. Like it seems to be the harness that respects skills the most. I know Claude and Codex are trying to work more on respecting skills, but Pi like always does exactly what my skills do, and you can do like /reload, so whenever you update skills you can also like have it hardwired into there without having to restart your client. So very cool, and we'll just have to keep updated on this, I guess. Okay, next we kind of have like a product discussion that I just thought was a little interesting. We're kind of having a diverse episode today, but we have a tweet from Pierre Richardson, who is the CEO of cow.com, which we had talked about previously, kind of like one of the founders of commercial open source, and I think they own a fund called Commercial Open Source. But he's talking about the idea of like settings, and this was talked about in like the pre-AI age, but it's still pretty interesting, especially now that we're building more products. In the AI age, it's one of those things that is going to be coming up again. He says he likes to think of settings as like a pressure valve and settings like in your product. So every time you add one, it's because you avoided making a real product decision. If you're not careful, your product becomes a graveyard of avoided decisions. Let's just add a setting often means we don't want to pick a default. It might feel diplomatic in the moment. Everyone gets what they want in the end except for the end user. They end up with a minefield of toggles they don't understand. Good products make strong choices. They say this is how it works by default because we believe this is the best way. So this is pretty interesting. You kind of like have to look at like consumer stuff. You look at like Mac OS, have a ton of settings, so you can change a lot of things in Mac OS, but the defaults are pretty user oriented and user friendly. Obviously, like the animations between switching between desktops is a story of its own, and I don't even use the multi-desktop, so maybe that's not a great example. But then you also look at like gaming and like those kind of applications where it's like they have tons of settings, and it's all about like kind of building the meta of settings outside of the system. So you would go to like Reddit or Google Docs or one of those things, and you'll have users cataloging different settings that are important for people. So enterprise software and like consumer business software is kind of like in the middle ground, where it's like you want some settings, but you also want people to just have a really good experience out the gate. So I'm not really sure what the best solution is, but nonetheless, it's very interesting that this is coming up again. And these kind of like philosophical ideas around product are very important. And this is where like the product people who really are going to change the game kind of come in and have really strong conviction. And like I wish I was one of those people, so I don't feel like I am. I'm still kind of like figuring that out. For me, I just try to go for the easiest default that feels right to me. Like there was another tweet I saw that was like building products is like just building things that you like and hoping it aligns with the population, and that's just kind of the truth. But very interesting here. And settings are kind of interesting, and there are like some default settings. Obviously you need to be able to change your email or whatever for a commercial product, but in terms of like what the theming looks like or like what colors you can have or what fonts you can have, that's where it gets a little bit complicated, and you don't want to cater to everyone. But the more you do cater to is like the more customizable it is for the superpower users. Okay, next we have the tweet that we were talking about earlier in the show, which is that Reese Sullivan, who works at OpenCode, previously worked at Vercel and Microsoft. He's saying that not having to type is really nice, but he thinks he wants to go back to manually writing the code himself and leveraging LLMs more for research and understanding of the code base. It's just too easy to defer your thinking today and end up in a bad state. This is super true. It is very easy to just like be like, build me this feature and just hope for the best. And where it gets back to what we were talking about with the Primeagen things, where it's like if you have your coding style very solidified, it's like what would a clone of you look like that writes this code? What are the decisions that you're making that makes your code better than the slop code that gets generated by AI? Like it's not just vibes. And that's where it's interesting. I was kind of talking to my OpenClaw about this, where it's like software engineering, since it's such a wide surface level compared to something like poker or gaming, it's really hard to min-max it. Like it's very much vibes based, and each solution is solved like on its own, because every solution that's been solved and been automated is already being solved, so our whole point of our job is to like solve problems that have never been solved before, or take tools that have been used to solve other problems and figure out how they mesh into these new problems. It's kind of like math, which is interesting because I'm not too deep into math, but my guess is like math and engineering is very similar to what software engineers do, even though people like to hate on software engineers and say that they're not actually engineers, which is fair enough. But definitely in terms of like the information that's available and what LLMs are good for, like research and understanding of the code base is very important, because the amount of tokens that they can take in is so much higher than humans, and the amount of tokens that they can output is so much higher than humans. But when you have that bottleneck of code review and making sure that the human is still liable for what the code does, it kind of hurts that output system, because there's too much output for the human to review to be accountable for that code. But in terms of the input and the information that can come into the LLM, that's where it's so valuable, because if you just know what right questions to ask, it'll get all the data for you, as opposed to having to read like 500 books. But then you can even argue like it's kind of noise versus signal. Like if you read 500 books, maybe there's one sentence in one of those books that you read read that the AI like missed compared to your question that would have just changed your whole philosophy and changed the whole world? It's kind of also like FOMO, like fear of missing out. So I don't know if that's super valid, but super interesting to think about. And personally, I'm having LLMs write all the code, but I do really believe in reviewing all the code. I still think that's very important. It's easy to like get sidetracked and feel like, okay, I don't need to read all of this code, or I don't need to understand all of it, because like, what am I actually adding of value here? But that gets to like one of the tweets we saw like a couple months ago, I think, that was like, the whole point of code review is that 99% of the time it's pointless, but the 1% of the time that it catches something that's really important, that 1% of that thing could completely destroy your company. So it's very like high risk, noise to signal, having to balance. So it makes software engineering very difficult compared to like games and all these other things like that are very closed loop, but fascinating. And we're still in the infancy of this industry, especially with AI. So we'll have to see where we go. Okay, and lastly, we have a tweet from Pieter Levels, which is replying to this leak from Anthropic, where they basically created their own like lovable competitor, where you can just put in a prompt and you get something out, or like Base 44, or all of these other, like Bolt, I think, is also still in existence. I actually heard recently like Bolt is still like doing pretty well in revenue, even though I've never heard of them in the past like year or two, even though they were one of the biggest like vibe coding platforms. It's kind of interesting like how big that market is and who those users are. It would be very interesting to interview them and talk to them about their products. But Peter is very opinionated on this, and very interesting point of view that he has. He says big tech will eventually come for all apps, startups, companies, because they can fill the niches now that before they could not, because they were too small. Those niches is where entrepreneurs hung out in nice parts of the market. People could build a little SaaS with 100K a year to even 100 mil a year revenue. Nothing like the 100 billion a year revenue big tech was doing, but worth it. With AI now, big tech can fill those niches, plus they're the ones training and owning the best models, keeping the best models for themselves. Then they can outcompete anyone who doesn't own them, everyone except other big tech. Endgame for their survival is simply trying to take every business. It's just capitalism. This completely changes the prospect for entrepreneurs, as there won't be much left because big tech is financially incentivized to have everything left, but if they don't, their competitor will. So this is interesting, and he talks about in reply as well, one of the like benefits of his philosophy at least is that all of the big tech companies are public, so you can at least take ownership in those gains. And it is true that the companies will want to keep growing, or they'll have to be replaced. But there's kind of like twofold to this from different people's responses. I'm just going to try to like combine all of the responses I was seeing, because there's too many to like focus on one specifically. But one of the replies for the devil's advocate of this is that these companies are so bureaucratic and so red tape oriented and like so risk averse that, and this is what Paul Graham was even talking about like 20 years ago, that they can't really take these risks. They can try to like launch these little products, but there's so much red tape and bureaucratism, and like everyone's trying to just add their own value so that they can get a promotion and they can get more money in their role, that they're kind of like handicapping each other. It's not like everyone's on the same team working for each other. It's like these different teams and these different individuals are really trying to help themselves only, and that's what they're mostly focused on. So that's where it gets complicated to like launch these things that are really impactful and like stay growing. And that's where it's like Google is known to like kill all of these products, because they can do a lot of quick launches, but they can't really maintain and build communities like startups can. And that speaks to kind of the second devil's advocate response, is that startups are more about like community and like vibes, and also like being cool is very important. That's where it gets to like, we haven't seen this lately with social media, so maybe it has kind of changed over time, but the whole thing was like, Facebook was the first one that was for college kids, and that was cool to use when you were in college in 2006. But then all the parents went on Facebook, and that's where you moved to Snapchat, because Snapchat's now for all the cool kids. And then as the parents get on all of these new platforms, you always have to move to a new platform. But now Instagram has kind of taken over all of social media, and obviously people use the other ones, but Instagram is like the number one leader in terms of like everyone, all the parents and the children have social media that is on Instagram. So that has kind of changed, but it's like even these new apps, like you look at like Gas, like kind of the Nikita beer ones, like Gas and TBH, which were basically Instagram plugins, but were also like cool, and had these things of like, you can see anonymously what if people like you, like that's the whole thing of like trying to have romantic relationships or trying to make money, are like the main two products you can sell to people, especially like teenagers and people who want status. That's where it's like you're always kind of pushing more towards the boundaries for these cool kids of what they want to use, and they're the ones who are creating the startups, and then basically the big tech companies just get to acquire them. Yeah, it's not really hurting these entrepreneurs that he's speaking about, because it's like you can build a little company that does like millions a year in revenue, like single digit millions, and then these big companies are like, oh, well, we can just acquire them for 10 to 50x revenue, and that saves us a lot of money, saves us a lot of time, and we get to actually take the talent that managed to build those systems and bring them in internally. And you can argue whether Nikita Beer is like how talented he is at the job he does, but he's successfully like built the same product twice. He knows how to get users, he knows how to make money. I know his latest product was kind of a flop, and that's why he went to Twitter possibly, but at Twitter he's very in tune with the community, and he kind of knows how to be like a head of product, even if it's kind of cringe. So still a lot of roles for entrepreneurs in this world, and that doesn't even consider like software engineers as well, which are always gonna, be making 6 to 7 figures because of like how much leverage their work has. And maybe AGI replaces us, but that's not happening anytime soon. That's kind of like the previous stories we talked about, where it's like people are starting to even go back to just writing code manually because they feel like LLMs have kind of been oversold and don't actually solve the main problems. And there might be a product that can fix all of this. This is where I'm very interested in, like, is there some product, some like startup operating system that can like really handle all of those pieces that kind of would make AGI more useful, or like at least make the LLMs more useful? It's kind of like the harness game, but it's also like these big companies have invested so much in their harnesses and they're not even that good. So it kind of speaks to like how good the models are. GPU shortages as well are very important. So nonetheless, it's very interesting. I don't know how I feel about this. I'm definitely still on like my entrepreneur slash software engineer journey, so I'm not changing because of this tweet, but it is something to keep in mind. And it also speaks to like if you invest in the stock market, you do kind of take advantage of all the wins of America and the tech game as well.